You want?
So, welcome everybody to this talk with Ben Haggarty. I'm sure most of you know who Ben Haggarty is, but I want to have a short introduction before we have the talk. And Ben Haggarty is one of the foremost storytellers in Europe. I mean, he has been influenced Europe, Norway, through his performances and all his activities like storytelling festivals, storytelling studies and schools, etc. One thing that I'm not sure if people are aware of is also that he has, which is important for me to raise these questions these days, is his clear influence on the art mythology, the art-based mythology. Every artist, every storytelling artist create their own mythology, but Ben Haggarty has been able to raise this up to a level where he reflects around this art, and in that he creates a discourse which has been influenced at least the storytelling study in Norway. I myself was lucky to be a student of Ben for a year and was very much influenced by him, and people still today, after all these years, because it was quite a long time ago, even though we're still young, still today, people can see that I've been a student of Mr. Haggarty. And my first question, thank you for your performance last evening, by the way, and our talk is basing on that performance. And my first question is the idea. Where does the idea of a performance come from? Are you expecting more?
No, that's a good question. I don't think it comes. It comes from finding a story that you like. So for me, I would argue always that the sort of storytelling I'm involved with, the sort of storytelling I promote, I support, I teach, is exclusively, more or less, working with traditional narratives, old stories. I think that all of them, if you can really get into a relationship with it, they're not old stories, they're just stories. And everything that's in them is interesting to human beings because it's always been interesting to human beings, because ever since we could speak, talk, walk, relate to each other, we've been fundamentally the same thing. So I hunt for stories that I like, and once I find something that says to me, you have to tell me, I get into relationship with it, and eventually I find myself telling these stories. And those stories that I told last night, in fact, all three of them were redundant stories from an ongoing project I've been doing for years and years and years, trying to explore this Panwani tradition from central India. And I've had an ongoing group of students and people trying to work with it for, I don't know, for 6 or 7 years now. And those three were early stories that I myself was using in those projects. And you saw a little bit the Panwani that Kirsty did, some of you. It wasn't quite Panwani what she was doing, because it had a text, and she was exploring the sound of this text through 3 different forms. But the secret of this very dynamic Indian tradition, and it's why I'm interested in it, is there's this person at the side who is throwing hand grenades at you, and at any moment can say something, and you have to include them, which means you have to abandon any sense of text, and the musicians have to abandon any sense of text. It's entirely an immediate improvisation now, not of making the story up, but of how the story is going to be told.
But I'm not sure if everybody knows this tradition, so
No.
you might maybe describe
So
how
what it involves is a solo performer, but the ragi, this second person at the side, and then musicians supporting it. And they tell, it's in central India, it's a very poor tribal farmers' tradition of telling the Mahabharata, which is this very long epic. And the performer who I've followed I first saw when she was 13. She was brought by a cultural organisation to England. I had already been alerted to this tradition by a theatre director called Habib Tanvir from India, who had also alerted a theatre director very famous called Peter Brook. And they had both spoken about this Panvani, so I wanted to find it, and it arrived suddenly in England. And she was 13 and quite the most extraordinary performer I've ever seen, and still remains one of the most extraordinary performers I've ever seen. So I went to India, found her and her teacher and her teacher's teacher, and eventually brought them to Britain 2 or 3 times, and kept a long ongoing relationship just with this form, but for many years without really having a good translation. So we were just copying the outside form, which is really interesting. Learning it from, well, they've got this person here, they've got these musicians, she moves in a certain way, there are certain postures. And so trying to work at it from the outside inwards. And then thanks to Kirsty, and we must thank her eternally, we had problems getting Ritu into Britain because our country is just turning into an immigration nightmare. It's horrific, it's horrible. Burning Spitfires crashing into the sea, dead, gone. Goodbye Britain. As we become Britain independent, it's horrible. But she's had 3 fails for getting in for stupid reasons, but we can't get her into Britain now anymore. But they got her for 10 days into Stockholm, and so a lot of us went and spent 10 days with a really good translator, really understanding what they are and are not doing, and some of the ideas we had are completely wrong, and some of the ideas were completely right. And so anyway, what I tried to do, which I think, on reflection was quite a brave thing, if I say it myself, is I had a particularly good group of students one year, a lot of very strong, really interesting, committed young people. And so I said, let's try this project, but you have to accept, I don't know how to do it, this is going to be a real experiment, I'm going to fail in front of you. And it was really difficult with your students who think you're a wonderful God to fail. And I lost 3 of them, they couldn't bear it. They couldn't bear suddenly to see this person who they thought could do everything, absolutely stuck, unable to do anything, just like they couldn't do anything. Because it's a style of storytelling that's absolutely based on finding the text, being interrupted, so it's improvisation of what you're saying, but also you're trying to move in a slightly restricted way, in a stylized way, you have a stick in your hand, and then there's music and pulse behind it. And so this was our Panvani project, it still continues, and now finally this year we have 2 really, really good musicians. I didn't want to waste money and time with good musicians until we understood how to do it, and myself, Emily Hennessy and Mikay Obey, who was there doing that, we're now doing this Panvani with a team of 5, it's fantastic, it's really good. We're in the middle of the tour.
But when you're performing alone, how do you
So then, the question that came was the old man who had made an intervention to revive and strengthen Panvani. So some of us met in Jarurah. I asked him one day, through an interpreter, did you ever see anything in telling a story that you had never seen before? And something happened in translation. He said, well, one day I was performing and I looked and I saw there sitting on the edge of the stage was Beam. And I turned and looked over my shoulder and there was Arjun. And from that day onwards, whenever I walked through a market, a woman would turn and it would be Draupadi. So that proposed something about what these stories contain as a psycho-biochemical possibility. And so the interest in imagination is really what's always brought me to storytelling. And the thing that clearly travels across languages and cultures has nothing to do with language or words. It's the story, and the story is not the word, it's what happens. So through the project with Panvani and one or two other things, I've become totally interested in this experience, I would say, that the story is a world. And there are some technical tricks to do with language, but to do with the self-immediate dramaturgical composition that one's doing in an improvisation, which enable you to walk into that world as you're telling the story. And then people will say, for instance, in the one I did yesterday, the king who eats himself, but he didn't eat his daughter, that's not in the story. But I'm sorry, it is in the story, because I was in the story and that's what happened. And I'm sure that's what happened. I've found in many, many stories, you're in the world, something happens. And there's a joke I tell Gilgamesh, I told it for many years. And at a certain moment, a long time ago, one of the first times I really told the whole thing as a long story, very identified with Gilgamesh and the journey and the hero's return. And at a certain moment, I'm not going to tell you the joke because one day you might hear me tell the story and it would spoil it. But there's a moment where there's a joke, a fantastic joke. It's not in the text, but it just, of course, that's what they say. And there's a question, and this is what is said. And everybody laughed. And in that moment I felt, and this joke was made 6,000 years ago. I didn't make up the joke. The joke is in the story. It's all in the story world. So the reason that I come to these stories, and I'm really not very interested in most of the other forms of narrative because they have their own mediums. Autobiography, you can write it. The news, it's in journalism. Hollywood has made wonderful things. Theatre, they're all different forms of storytelling in different mediums, and they have different repertoires appropriate. And I'm just puzzled why people want to bring autobiographical stories into storytelling when there's already perfectly good media for doing that. It's called writing. But what doesn't work is the telling of myths, fairy tales, folk tales, this repertoire in those media. I've never seen a traditional narrative made into a good film. I've seen some that are nearly good, but they still don't have the power of the story when it's being told. So this is the repertoire for this media. This medium is a medium of a living audience. I don't think there's anything to do with storytelling that involves technology, because I think it's not this essential, profound first storytelling from the fire and the dark in the cave in the Stone Age times, unless the audience and the teller are breathing the same air. It's not possible to do it on the internet through recordings. You can get something approximate, but the real thing involves the air being breathed between everybody. And
I have another question, because our time is
it's
quite
very
long.
limited.
Speaking about repertoire, etc., I know there are quite young students here also. And do you think there's a canon for storytelling?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is a training repertoire. It's very clear that the most useful stories for students to learn are what I would categorize as folk tales, the trick tales, the stories of the rich and the poor, the wise and the foolish, the men and the women, the old and the young, these chaotic little funny comedic stories. But they're fun, they're not too long, and they have problems in them. There are challenges for the storyteller. So very famously, it's in Scandinavia, this story of the husband and the wife who swap roles, and they end up with a cow on the roof. It's an incredible exercise for the storyteller of putting things in position, lining up the dominoes so that it can all fall down together. There are other stories with long, long lists of things that have to be learned. And it's in that repertoire there that there is the fundamental training repertoire for a storyteller. You can learn everything about timing, comedy, physicality. Everything is in these funny stories. And the trouble is, in the UK, I don't know how it is elsewhere, but all the storytellers who want to come to storytelling, generally they want to tell magical stories of transformation and myth and this, that, and the other. And so they start with these impossibly difficult stories to tell. And then what about these silly, funny, they're not very funny, but when you can really make a believable world, then as they say in theatre, the suspension of disbelief is complete, and people will laugh at the cook sharpening her knife, and these silly stories, but still suddenly they have a reality. So they're the training stories, the beginning of a repertoire of training. And they shouldn't be overlooked. We run to stuff that's far too complicated. Once you've got that, once you can tell the cow on the roof well, then maybe you can start to do a fairy tale or something. And I personally, I believe that the answers to all our challenges and questions as people trying to interest people in storytelling is look in tradition, because somewhere they already had this problem and somewhere they already found a solution to it. So, in a way, the imagination, the main tool of the storyteller is the imagination. So, even when dealing with the question of how can we make storytelling spread through the world or revive it or whatever, use your imagination. It's there. That's the
We
way.
have 4 minutes left. Maybe there's some questions to Ben Haggarty. Concerning the performance yesterday, maybe. You told 4 stories, real and Greek myths. Is there something about Greek myths because I think today also you will have a Greek...
Yeah. Well, interestingly, to confess and to come back to it, I don't really like any of those stories. It's a really interesting thing. We needed to, with the Panvani project, we needed short Iron Age, Bronze Age stories. And I didn't feel I wanted to tell stories from India. We were trying to find this tradition. The problem is it's to do with the Mabinogion in Wales, which is a mess. And what energy should be brought to it? And I feel Panvani energy is the right energy. So I was looking for stories, and then I saw some colleagues of mine telling some Greek myths, and very clearly they were censoring them. They were still telling them to an adult audience as if they were for children. And I thought, how dare you? I find you at great expense an audience, and you treat them like children. Everybody knows that when it says he hides them in his thigh, he's not hiding this child in his thigh, he's sewing him into his testicles. It's absolutely for true. That's what I believe. That's what's there. Why don't you say that? And Ovid, who wrote down some of these stories, it's just 6 sentences, but you can spin it out to 45 minutes. If you go into the story, it's all there. He already, one understands, in his writing was having to censor the story because of who his paymaster was. He didn't want to offend, but these stories are much stronger. So I started telling these Greek stories, never having told. These are the first 3 Greek stories I told. And they began to explode and everything. Wow, this is an incredible world. I don't like it, but it needs to be told. And then what you come to in the end is the fact that hundreds of thousands of human beings have told these stories and loved these stories and shaped them. So in the end what comes out is love. I still like this story, but it's full of love. It's terribly violent, but it's full of love of all those who have engaged with it. So it's just, that's what's happening with those. However, the one I'm going to do a little bit later on, Atalanta, I love that story. And that's a whole other thing. It's not one who came from Panvani, it's one who I found another way. So.
Yeah, 1 minute left. You can maybe tell, do you still take students?
We have a 3-year-old in the house, and as the students are in our house, we don't at the minute. Plus the house is falling down the hill, so we'll be open for business in about 2 years' time.
But one thing you can say something about shortly, we have 1 minute left now, is, I mean, as I said in the beginning, Ben Haggarty has influenced the storytelling in Europe, but there are still countries in Europe who doesn't have storytelling. They have, of course, but not in the sense some of us know. And you have this project in Romania.
Yeah, thanks to Fest, and I really thank Fest for it. I had encountered there was a small storytelling festival in Cluj, which is the second city in the capital of Transylvania, about 5 years ago, organised by a British woman who was over there. She said, "Look, do storytelling," and she did this thing. And I met a guy who was translating for me, and he was brilliant. And he was the teacher of commedia dell'arte in the drama department of the university. And we had this encounter, and then last year he wrote to me and said, "Do you remember we met 3 years ago? I wrote this essay." And he sent this incredible essay about storytelling as a sort of an experience of 45 minutes, actually, that had changed his life. So I thought, okay, I'm going to get you to Britain and I'll give you a free place on a course, and this is good. But then Fest came up with this idea of training, and I suddenly thought, well, even better, I could go work with your students and teach him at the same time, and maybe he could then teach what I'm trying to teach in his way to his students. And so I worked a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going in a couple of weeks again to work a second time with 13 second-year commedia dell'arte students, 2 dives. They can move, they can dance, they can improvise, they can acrobat, they can juggle, they can work together, they can work on their own. They've got voices, they can sing, and just very funny, beautiful things. I do simple exercises with stepping backwards and forwards and speaking as we do it. So I was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 backwards, but they were 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, putting a little dance step into it. So the tradition is closer to them. But their relationship with their narratives is completely spoiled by the Soviet experience. So they don't know, in fact, their own stories. So there's something very rich, and some of them immediately. There's one girl there from Moldavia she could go out and be the best storyteller for a year in Europe, and then nothing. But for 1 year she would have a chance to go to every festival. It'd be great, just from 30 hours of contact. But she has it. She's got English as well, so she really has something. So, what's interesting is to meet a group of students who are being trained in a very rigorous tradition. So they're already responsive to the idea of tradition, and that there might be techniques to deliver something that's not original. But what I'm teaching them, and what I always teach, is that the whole trick of working with traditional narrative is once you've learnt it, you can say absolutely what you want to say, as well as let the story say what it wants to say. But you can say, I did it all, the whole show last night was actually, I said what I wanted to say. I had complete artistic, free self-expression through the medium of apparently traditional narratives. You now know everything about me, what I believe about everything. It was there. You don't have to agree with it, but if as a creative person with an artistic impulse, you want to self-express, you can do it totally working in this traditional medium, because the stories are viral, so they infect you. There needs to be something they give you, and the deal is, you tell us, we'll help you say what you want to say. That's the deal. Somebody else will take the story and they'll tell the story will travel, but also you would have been able to say what you needed to say. So it's just because it's old doesn't mean it's good, but this search for modernizing, creating a new context for story, all this kind of thing, that's because the funders don't recognize it. But the storytellers know that the fundamental thing, all you need is possibility of more or less silence, possibility of focus, comfortable audience. Don't need anything else.
Let's just end there. Thank you for this.